please stand if you're able for the reading of the gospel? Today's gospel reading is from the book of John, chapter 10, verses 22 through 30. At that time, the festival of the dedication took place in Jerusalem. It was winter, and Jesus was walking in the temple in the portico of Solomon. So the Jews gathered around him, and they said to him, "How long will you keep us in suspense? If you're the Messiah, tell us plainly." Jesus answered, "I have told you, and you do not believe. The works that I do in my Father's name testify to me, but you do not believe because you do not belong to my sheep. See, my sheep hear my voice. I know them, and they follow me. I give them eternal life, and they will never perish. No one will snatch them out of my hand. What my Father has given me is greater than all else, and no one can snatch it out of the Father's hand. The Father and I are one." The Gospel of the Lord. You may be seated. So I heard a pastor tell a story recently that I would like to relay to you this morning. He was talking about how one Wednesday after confirmation, he was waiting with the last student. There was a young lady who was waiting for her mom to pick her up, and she was running a little late, and so they were just hanging out and visiting a little bit. And the confirmation student asked the pastor the question that every confirmation student ever has asked at some point in time, which is, "So pastor, why do I need to go to confirmation anyway?" And her reasoning was this. She said, I've been going to church since I was little. I know all the stories. I know the difference between right and wrong. Life's really busy. Why do we need to bother going to confirmation? And so he answered her, and the answer that would, most often come to mind first, well, when you were baptized, your family agreed to raise you up in the ways of the church. It's important to be part of a body of believers. And then all of a sudden her mom came, and the conversation ended rather abruptly, and the girl went home, and the pastor went home, and even though the answers that he gave were correct, he said it always felt like he missed an opportunity to give a really important answer to a really important question. And so on further reflection, he said what he wanted to say was, "I want you to know Jesus well enough that you will recognize him when you see him, even outside of these walls." I really, really like that way of thinking. I want to know him well enough so I'll recognize him when I see him, even in places where I wouldn't expect to. Sometimes I wonder if we're maybe a little bit hard of hearing or hard of seeing when it comes to Jesus. Are we listening to his voice and hearing what he says and then doing what he tells us to do? Do we know him when we see him? Do we recognize him when we hear his voice? Every day we hear a lot of different voices around us, fairly discordant voices sometimes. It can be overwhelming. There are voices out there telling you who you are or who you should be, who you should aspire to be, who you should decide to help, who you should be afraid of. So the question is, how do you discern what voice to listen to, which voice to follow? We may be tempted to think that things were simpler in biblical times, but even Paul said that there were many voices in the world and all of them affect your well-being. It's a little bit like the background music in a store. You hear it, but you're not always fully aware of it. It's the same with these voices, that they play in the background, and we're influenced by whatever we might be most receptive to, either the sounds of darkness or perhaps the melodies of heaven. Just as the voice of the shepherd is not always easy to discern because it's not always obvious or spoken plainly, like the folks in the text said today, the voice of the enemy isn't always obvious either. You would think that, the non-shepherding voice would come in the form of temptation, but sometimes it comes even more incessantly in the form of condemnation or accusation, maybe slander or fear, even worry. Anything to get you to respond. Listening to the wrong voice can separate us from God. It can create fear, create condemnation, lead us to extremes or to pride, even cause us to reject God because we think he has rejected us, maybe create doubt. But in today's gospel lesson, Jesus talks about how his flock knows his voice as the voice of the shepherd. They know it when they hear it, and they follow him. We must learn to respond to the shepherd's voice. If we don't, we might become prone to follow the voice of another because we won't recognize the difference. This other voice, this non-shepherding voice, is the voice of a thief who steals from us, who snatches us away. He steals our peace of mind, our sense of security, our confidence, sometimes even our standing with Christ. So what voice do you hear? Whose voice are you following? Do you hear the voice of grace? Well, the kids at Luther Hall do. Luther Hall is a place that's operated by Lutheran Social Services where kids go to try to put things back together when the things in their life have fallen apart. The kids who come to Luther Hall have often suffered from abuse. They experience severe mental illness. They've been suicidal. They might be prone to harming themselves. And their families, their schools, and frankly, their everyone just doesn't know what to do anymore. They're at their wits' end. These are the kids that everybody around them knows is troubled, the disruptive one, the kid who's different. These kids are used to being looked askance at. So last fall, we asked some of the kids who are living with us at Luther Hall, and we usually have 16 boys and girls ages 10 to 18 with us at any one time, and we asked them, if you could tell people what we do at Luther Hall, what would you say? How would you describe this place? And the answer that we got from them, their consensus answer, to me epitomizes that voice of grace. They said that Luther Hall is a place that you can go to get help and no one will judge you. Grace. You don't earn your way to acceptance. You don't deserve your way to love. You come as you are. You're accepted as you are. You're loved as you are. What voice do you hear? Whose voice are you following? Do you hear the voice of abundance? The seniors who volunteer as senior companions do. A woman from Jamestown who's in her mid-60s shared her thoughts with us on what it means for her to volunteer with Lutheran Social Services as a senior companion. Here's what she said. When I visit, we can talk old times, remembering the things that happened, the smell of coffee, cookies, and fresh bread. I feel blessed learning from elderly people who I see every week. Taking someone on a shopping trip, getting their groceries, having a meal, or playing a game. A sense of humor also plays a huge part in the visits. A smile, a laugh, and a hug ends the visit until the next one. A person doesn't have to have much to live a life with abundance, to give much, serving others and being blessed in return. So what voice do you hear? Whose voice are you following? Do you hear the voice of justice and compassion? The people who found a safe and affordable place to live did. We know, we've been going to church for a long time, most of us have. We know it's good to treat others as you would have them treat you, but are we listening to the voices around us to make sure that children have food, families have homes, the sick can be cared for? Well, across the state, Lutheran Social Services affordable housing staff work behind the scenes every day to try and answer that call and to hear that voice. In Devil's Lake, a young mother of 2 boys came to us in dire straits. She needed to remove herself and her kids from an abusive situation. In Langdon, a middle-aged woman suffering from mental health issues had been unable to secure stable housing for months and was living in a really, really unsafe way. A young man who had a traumatic brain injury, whose behavioral outbursts, all of them related to that injury, had caused him to lose his previous housing, leaving him with no permanent home that he could call his own. An 88-year-old widow from Rugby was looking for a safe place to move after deciding to leave the farm. She'd been turned down by several landlords who thought it might be too much work to serve somebody with no rental history, 68 years on the farm, and may not be a long-term tenant after all. It's such a basic thing, but that doesn't mean that it's a given. Every one of the individuals I talked about above now has a place to live, and they were treated with dignity and respect and compassion. What voice do you hear? Whose voice are you following? Do you hear a voice of hospitality? The men, women, children, and elders who have left everything behind to flee violence and persecution do hear that voice when they start their new lives in North Dakota. We know we're to love our neighbors as ourselves. We know that we're to show kindness to strangers. We know that Jesus said, when you serve the least among us, you are serving me. Well, when we welcome refugees to our communities, we are hearing that voice of hospitality. A smiling face of welcome at the airport. A Social Security Administration clerk who with kind eyes helps overwhelmed newcomers complete the paperwork that helps them get started on their new life. An employer who with open arms welcomes new people into their workplace family, finding creative ways for everyone to feel a sense of belonging and that they are a part of. A teacher whose warmth and openness helps melt the fears that come from being really different in a really new school, where the new child's excited to learn but struggles to understand all of the newness that is. A nurse who sees each patient as the person that they are and not just the next number to be served in a very, very busy day. That is the voice of hospitality, heard and answered. What voice do you hear? Whose voice are you following? Do you happen to hear the voice of hope? A young mom who was desperately trying to find a way to overcome trauma did. There was a young pregnant woman who started talking with our healthy family staff person in Grand Forks towards the end of her pregnancy. She had moved to the oil patch from one of the southern states. She ended up homeless, only able to find minimal employment. She was raped and became pregnant. She chose life for her unborn child, but the barriers that she had to overcome were great because of the trauma that she suffered. And in addition to all the other challenges, she was now dealing with significant depression and ultimately became jobless. When she came to us, she was truly a woman without hope. But in working with the Healthy Families Home Visitor every week, both before the baby was born and after, this mom began to bond with the baby. The beauty and the power of that mother-child bond brought a spark of hope back into her life. And as this child grew, she became focused. This child became the motivation that she needed to help her move forward. And she's now in permanent housing, she's employed, and she's seeing the joy that this child brought to her life. She's beginning to thrive, and once more has hope and joy in her life. What voice do you hear? Whose voice are you following? If you're listening to the voice of grace and abundance, justice and compassion, hospitality, hope, and love, you are hearing the voice of the shepherd. And if you're hearing his voice, you're part of his flock. In today's passage, we read that the setting for this story was on the Festival of Dedication. And today, I'm kind of hoping that it can be a day of dedication or maybe rededication for all of us to listen, to hear, and to follow. To recognize the shepherd's voice even outside of these walls, where you don't expect to hear it. What voice do you hear? Whose voice are you following? Will you recognize Jesus' voice when you hear it? Amen.